Happy Tuesday, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I've met all of you, so I don't need to introduce myself, as I've been doing in past with other groups. But I'm glad to be given the opportunity to study with my friends. So I hope that we can learn together and mutually be benefited by studying together. So let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, I invite the Holy Spirit to be with us. I invite you that we can learn together, that you can be part of this process of understanding the times in which we're in. I pray and ask that this may be a mutually beneficial experience, not just for those listening in, but for myself as well, as I seek to learn as well. And I pray that all the things that we go over may be in accordance with your will. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So, I think as part of this exercise, if you can call it that, with the different ministries and groups in the movement, I've done about 6-7 studies thus far. I can't remember, and I've gone over. I had initially had the intention of just doing the same presentation, through in each of the different ministries, but I realized that by the time I get to the last one, I'd probably get bored, and so I'd lose my mind if I did that. And I guess that just makes it more difficult for everyone else, because I do stuff and then build on that stuff. So today's study, unfortunately, is going to be built on stuff that I've gone over before. However, I'll try and go over different concepts, and if you'd like a bit more deeper dive into something that I might have said, I can point you in that direction. But again, a difference with previous studies that I've done is that they've been more of presentations and with Q&As at the end. But I want to try and do something a bit more different this time and make it into a study with a contribution, your contributions as we go along, if that's okay. So please feel free to participate actively, ask questions, and share your thoughts about different ideas. So I guess where this journey started, with regards to my studies particularly, if I can sum it up, has been about the image of the beast, and then expanding on that, the threefold union as a whole, and trying to identify who the different players are. I know we've done that in studies as a movement, but just with every developing truth, I feel like as time goes on, it gets more refined. And so I've tried to pinpoint who exactly those players are. So I guess the first question I can ask is, where do we get this idea of a threefold union originally? I know we look in Old Testament scriptures to identify a repeating pattern, but where is this threefold union spoken about?
Revelation. Right?
So in the Bible, from the Bible first of all.
From the Bible. There's this
Revelation. Well,
the smoke coming out of the pit, and then 3 different
entities.
Yeah. So where exactly in Revelation is that? I'm going to go in my Bible as well. So I'll point you in the chapter, Revelation 16.
Yeah.
And then if you go
Revelation, is it 16:13?
Yeah. So Revelation 16:13.
Yeah.
I like frogs.
The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet.
Okay, yeah. And so as it was mentioned, we have the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And then we go into different stories in the Old Testament to see how we have this repeating pattern, whether it's the story of Salome and Elijah and etc. We see this alliance riddled throughout the Bible. And what is a recurring pattern is that each of these different entities represent a specific entity. There's a specific player that each of them represents. And in past studies, and I guess which will be my point throughout these, is that the dragon represents a state entity. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. The beast is going to be a religious entity.
Mm-hmm.
And then the false prophet is going to be religious again. But what's the difference between the beast and the false prophet? Why aren't they just the same entity?
Because the beast is openly false.
Openly a counterfeit, if you want to call it that.
It's very obvious to see. And the false prophet should be the right one, but
yeah, I like
it's
that.
not. Yeah.
So there's an element where they were once God's people, and then they turn on God. So you see that in the story of Balaam, where Balaam is called to do a work by God, but then Balaam ends up not opposing God, and so ends up being a false prophet. That's why you have this distinction of false prophet and the beast. So when we go into Revelation 13, we get more insights into who this beast is. And that's your first 10 verses. And so from that, we get the beast as the papacy. And I think that consistently, Ellen White refers to the beast as the papacy.
Mm-hmm.
And as you track that story in Revelation 13, the first 10 verses, then the next, you're going to learn about an image of the beast that's created and the whole work that's going to happen at the end of the world. What I want to consider is the story of Babylon is fallen. So Babylon, we can reference it back to this threefold union, because it says in Revelation that Babylon is broken up into 3 parts, and the 3 parts that it is the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Yeah? If at any point you disagree with a point I make, then just speak up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 3 parts now. Is there a reason why John refers to Babylon as broken up into these specific 3 parts and not just bad people? What point is John trying to make when he refers to Babylon as broken up into 3 parts? Dragon, beast, false prophet. We'll explore that as we go along. So let's consider literal Babylon, because that's where the story begins. In Acts 27, we have the Isle of Malta. Paul is going to be on that ship with the sailors and the prisoners, and they're meant to be going in a specific direction. They take a wrong course. Paul warns them of that, and eventually they get to a point where Paul has a vision, an angel tells him that shipwreck is coming. That's at midnight. And then Paul has to navigate that ship and advise the captains, and Paul's advice to save everyone is to just go full steam ahead into the land, to crash that ship. So crashing that ship was necessary for saving. And we see this story replicated in ancient Babylon, where we have the Israelites go into captivity. So why do those Israelites go into captivity in the first place? Why did God need to bring Babylon to take them into captivity? What was the purpose of that?
To save them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
To save them. Often it can be interpreted as God being punitive, but in fact it was for their own sake, to save them from themselves, a redemptive story. So while in captivity, for those years that they stayed in captivity, the 70 years, they weren't meant to become like the Babylonians. Many of them ended up eating from the king's table, but you have the 3 Hebrew boys, who I'm going to say is going to represent a remnant of God's people who behave good, who do the right thing. And in that history of the Israelites' captivity, you have Nebuchadnezzar and the story of the image, and there Nebuchadnezzar is going to represent 2 things. Nebuchadnezzar is going to represent the church, as in a religious entity that receives worship, and he's going to represent the state. So that church-state union is in one entity, and that's Nebuchadnezzar. And you see that throughout pagan Rome. And then when you get to papal Rome, there's this separation. I think 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲 had pointed out the counterfeit and how it parallels the true. Until Israel was church and state combined, then you get this separation, etc. In Isaiah's prophecies and a large part of Jeremiah's prophecies, he's going to talk about the Israelites and why they're in captivity, what they can do to get out of captivity. And so that's the judgments on God's people. But in the same breath, Jeremiah is going to point to the judgments on the captor. So if that ship was meant to crash, and God brought Babylon as a tool in their hand, why do they get judged? What was the purpose for them getting judged if God is using them as a tool themselves? I'll point you in the direction. Daniel 4. What's the story of Daniel 4?
The Nebuchadnezzar going crazy.
Yeah, essentially. Let's go there because there's interesting wording that I want to pick up. So from verse 10, 11, 12, 10, 11, and 12. I'll read it. I'm going to read it in a different version, not King James Version. So now Nebuchadnezzar is having his dream, his second dream, and he's at his palace. He's lying in his bed, and he has visions. And so he calls all the wise men to come and interpret the visions. And Daniel comes, and the visions that he has is that from verse 11, the tree grew. From verse 10. These are the visions I saw while I was lying in my bed. I looked, and there in front of me was a tree standing in the middle of the earth. The tree was very tall. The tree grew large and strong. The top of the tree touched the sky. It could be seen from everywhere on the earth. The leaves of the tree were beautiful. It had good fruit on it, and on the tree was plenty of food for everyone. The wild animals found shelter under the tree, and the birds lived in its branches. Every animal ate from the tree, etc., etc. And Daniel's going to explain that this was the purpose of Babylon. So Babylon was meant to be a protector. It was meant to do God's work while the Israelites were in captivity. So they were on the right side of the issue. They were supposed to be on the right side of the issue. And then Jeremiah is going to point out that they didn't do this work. That's why Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy, and they end up going into captivity. So Babylon was supposed to stand at a certain point, and then you get to Jeremiah 51, and Jeremiah is going to say Babylon is fallen. So that's where we get the original reference for Babylon is fallen. And Isaiah will say it as Babylon is fallen, and that's what John just repeats. To fall, you need to be standing in the first place. So Babylon standing, and then Babylon falls. That's literal Babylon. Now let's go to spiritual Babylon and the papacy. And that's again in Revelation 13. You have a separation of church and state. And there's 2 specific dates that I want to point out. 533 and 538. From memory, what do we mark as taking place in 533?
The Justinian decree.
Yeah. And what was Justinian's decree? He essentially said, you Pope, you are the head of all churches. So the papacy had been rising all this time, and Justinian's going to say, okay, I've converted to Christianity, and I'm going to recognize the bishop in Rome as the head of all the churches in my kingdom. So you have church and state coming together for the first time under Justinian, but it had been a work in progress up until that point. And then in 538, the Ostrogoths are removed, and now this decree is going to be enforced. So the reason why I bring this up is because often we mark this as a Sunday law, because in Orleans, at some church, they created a Sunday law. We also mark church and state combined, church and state coming together. But 533 in its own right is a Sunday law waymark as well. So this being the cause and this being the effect. So here, the state now is going to give their arms to the papacy. So the papacy is going to get power. And in 533, it's created. This issue of church and state coming together is created. If you read in Revelation 13 from verse 1 to 10, it talks about this process where the beast is rising up out of the earth, and eventually the dragon needs to give this beast power. The beast in this story is papacy, and the dragon in this story is pagan Rome. In Daniel 2, in that statue in Daniel 2, you have iron. There's 4 kingdoms, and then you have iron plus clay. This iron runs throughout. It's in the legs, and then it's in the feet and the toes. So when we compare and contrast that history with our own, we should recognize the same thing, that this state, the dragon, is going to be here, and it's going to be the same thing that's found in the feet and toes. It doesn't transition from Rome into something else. It's the same from legs down to toes, once you get that combination of church and state. So now taking this framework and going to Millerite history, because now there's going to be a transition. It's no longer going to be the beast. Now we're expecting the image of the beast. Leading up to 1798, between 538 and 1798, in this 1260 period, who's on the bad side of the issue? I'm going to just simplistically label it as good side and bad side. You have the bad side, which is the papacy. And the good side is who? Who's opposing the papacy?
Protestants.
The Protestant churches. So they're doing God's work in opposing the papacy. So America opens its shores to absorb this flood of persecution that's going on. Just like what Babylon's original purpose was in literal Babylon. They were meant to stand up and protect God's people while they being reformed, if you want to call it that. And these churches who are standing at this point, once the USA opens its shores and people migrate into the USA, the job of these churches is to do what? It's to protect God's people. So they're standing during the 1260, and eventually you get to this time period where William Miller is preaching his message, and Ellen White gives commentary about these churches who were once standing. And so I'll read a snippet from GC 382, paragraph 3. She's talking about Babylon as being the mother of harlots, just reading it as she said, as she says it. But her daughters must be symbolized by churches that cling to her doctrines and traditions, etc., etc. Then she's going to talk about Revelation 14 and the fall of Babylon. And she says the message of Revelation 14 announcing the fall of Babylon must apply to religious bodies that were once pure. So they were pure and have become corrupt, and then they fall. My stick figure looks nice. And so they're pure and then they corrupt. They're standing and then they fall, etc. And then she gives commentary rebuking the Protestant churches. For in other places she'll rebuke them for compromising with regards to slavery, stating that they endorsed slavery, and so because they endorsed slavery, they're now fallen and are part of Babylon. In commenting about the Civil War, now giving commentary about the North and the South, I'm going to read from 1T264.1. I'm going over all of this so that we get it fixed in our minds who the problem is and what the problem is. In previous studies, there was a bit of back and forth as to who's to blame at the end of the world, or who causes the issues at the end of the world. So all this will tie together at the end. But in 1T264.1, in commenting about slavery and the Civil War, Ellen White points out that God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. God has the destiny of the nation in their hands. God will punish the South for the sin of slavery. So the South, the sin of slavery that's the blood on their hands. And then she's going to call out the North as well. And the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. So basically the North for compromising. Not because they create the slavery issue, but because they don't do enough to stop it, essentially. So who's to blame for the testing issue in this history? It's the South, because they create it. The reason why the North is getting judged is because they didn't do enough to fight something that was already created by the South. And then you can go on and explore the North and the South's role in all of that. Transitioning now to our history. So we have our 1260 from 1863 to 1989. That's our 126. And now I want to go to Revelation 13 verse 11 again, because that's where we're going to get insights for our test. So in Revelation 13 verse 11, I spoke about how with Rome and the papacy, it was the legs of iron, and then they were found in the feet and the toes. So when we get to Revelation 13, we see the same issue presented, or the same dynamic. John, in commenting about the USA, because we know this is commentary about the USA, he says that he sees a beast coming out of the earth. This beast has two horns, two lamb-like horns. And then it reaches a point where, I'm just going to write it, it's going to become a dragon. So this entity is the same entity in phase 1. And then you're going to get to phase 2, and it is going to transition into the dragon. So if you were to compare and contrast this with Daniel 2, it would be iron, and then here still iron, but now iron plus clay. And the key point that I'm making here is that it's iron throughout, and the iron that you see throughout is the same entity. So we know that phase 1 is USA, so phase 2 is USA. The compare and contrast would be Rome and Rome, pagan Rome and pagan Rome. And then you're going to get to John's going to give commentary about how the dragon does all this persecution, etc., etc. But I want to go down to verse 14. Verse 14 and 15. And there John is going to tell us that this entity, it's now a dragon now, is going to deceive everyone. It has the power to do all these miracles, etc. And then it's going to call for an image to be created. So now, first, we have an image created. Like we did in 533. We have the image created. And then the next step, because this image can't do anything as just a creation, in verse 15 it says, now this dragon is going to give power to this image. Power given to this created image. So the question is, who creates this image? And what is it? And when? Who, what, and when? This is all in the context of the Sunday law, recalling the relationship between 533 and 538. So in 𝗷𝗴𝗃𝗲𝗃 Vesper studies, I won't go over it in detail, 𝗷𝗴𝗃𝗃 is going to make the point that we're living in a culture war. We're living in a time period where there's no church-state union. There's, if you want to call it, a culture-state union. And that's not to say that the Protestant churches aren't in part of this. It's making the point that culture is the pervading issue. It's the pervading sin, if you want to call it that. And that's the thing that's going to drive the Sunday law. It's going to come from a culture war. Prior to our time of the end, 1989, and prior to every time of the end, you have this 10-year period. And we can see the Afghan Civil War, USSR America Civil War, as a proxy war that Adventist churches were meant to see and were meant to recognize that 1989 is coming. But there's another history that we tie to that. What's that other history? This 10 years. So not the USSR.
The moral majority.
And what were their aims? Why were they active here? What did they want?
Was this their where they tried to win the Catholics in the abortion question?
Amongst other things, but okay. I'm looking for the broader strategy. So
get America conservative again.
Yeah, essentially.
Implement God again in the state.
So you have 𝗷𝗴𝗃𝗲𝗃𝗲, and they see that America's becoming irreligious, and they want America to go back to God. But there's specific issues that they care deeply about. And so they're going to look for someone to do their work. And eventually they find Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party more broadly. So the Republican Party is now going to do the work of bringing us to the Sunday law. Because of this 10-year setup, if you want to call it that. And so the Republican Party becomes the conduit for their fight. And so when we talk about abortion, in America, is it a culture issue or is it a church issue? One could argue that it's both, because culture and religion are two sides of the same coin. But who's driving the fight? And we'll explore that in a bit more detail. One of our primary modes of understanding truth is compare and contrast. When God called the disciples out of the Jewish church, or when God pulls a stone out of the mountain, we recognize that as being God first giving a call to the church and then the world. So God is going to go church and then world. And from the church, God is going to call out their own church so that this church can evangelize the world. So Satan is going to do the exact same thing. Satan is going to first find their church or their movement to do the work, to take Satan's message to the world. Because Satan has a message. Whatever that message is, Satan has a message. And Satan needs someone to do that for them. I just want to note a few statistics about America. I'll write the polling agencies. In fact, if you want the polling agencies, I'll tell you, but it's not particularly necessary to the point. In the 1990s, this polling agency points out that approximately 90% of US adults identified as Christians. And then they do this poll every so often, but now in 2023, the most recent poll, approximately 68% are Christians, identify as Christians at least. And another polling group, now with regards to practicing Christians, pointed out that in the 2000s, 45% of Americans were practicing Christians. So not just saying, I'm a Christian, but do you go to church? Do you believe in the church doctrines, etc.? That's 45%. And then you get to 2019, and that number basically drops by half to 25%, roughly. The point is that if we compare the 1800s, where we have Sunday laws as being the thing, wanting God in the Constitution, wanting to Christianize the nation, etc., religion is not a priority today as it was in the 1800s. So, if Satan wants to give a message to receive a mark, to receive worship, what's Satan going to use? Is Satan going to use evangelical churches? I'll read an article I found online, and you can find the same sentiment from various other places. I'll put the quote in the chat. I have to give this disclaimer every time I share this, that I'm not endorsing the website that it's from, but the sentiment is what I want to pick up. And the author of this article says that this poll was done that shows for the first time that affiliation with church, synagogue or mosque, essentially religion, no longer defines the majority of Americans. In the 2 decades since the turn of the millennium, religious affiliation has gone from 70%, where it stood in the 1930s, to 47%. So it's dropped a lot. And among millennials, only 36% say they belong to organized religion. For us in Europe, that's pretty normal. But for America, that's a big thing, because America was so Christian, was so religious. And then they go to point out that what we're witnessing, it seems, is not a collapse in the religious impulse as such. So people's desire to find meaning in life and purpose, that's intrinsic to who we are as humans. What we're witnessing is what happens when politics replaces or becomes a form of religion. The fusion of evangelical Christianity with the Republican Party blasphemously climaxed in the Trump cult. Among the Trump banners and a Confederate flags in the crowd that invaded the Capitol on 6 January was a flurry of wooden crosses. And in wokeness, so the author is going to compare and contrast two groups. The side one, where you have the Trumpists, not trumpets, Trumpists, and then side two. And he or she, I can't remember, they are, when talking about side one, are going to point out that at these political events, they're taking their religious zeal with them, with their Confederate flags and their wooden crosses and etc. in this political issue. But side two, and in wokeness, so your woke side, the younger generation are quite obviously replicating previous religious movements in America. Look at the zeal in their eyes and the relentless search for heresy, the ostracization of sinners, the mass confessions of iniquity, and the need to do the work every day to bring about the kingdom of anti-racism. So for them, their religion is found in wokeness, essentially. So all that this author or this narrator is pointing out is that politics is the religion of culture wars. So in our history, in our dispensation from 1989 to the Second Advent, we're in a culture war. And what was the churches for the Millerites today is politics. So where religion, this belief in a deistic being and organized religion, has churches, today in a culture war, it's going to be fights over politics, what politics you hold dear to you. And what do politics have in this compare and contrast? Religion has churches, politics has
Parties.
political parties. In a book I read, I think it's by the same author of a book I've shared before. The book is called The Righteous Mind, and the author makes the point that when you look at religious groups and you look at people who are involved in politics, they serve similar social functions in that they bring people together with regards to a shared moral code, a sense of belonging, and sacred values that they hold dear. So now in our dispensation, I'm going to suggest that instead of churches being the ones that drive the Sunday law, it's now going to be political parties. They take that, I'll say political parties. They take that mantle, that do that work. And so in that threefold union that we discussed earlier, where we had the dragon, a state entity, the papacy as the beast, who is the false prophet? Because the question I asked was, Satan is going to give a message to join their kingdom. If Satan sends out churches to give their message, who's going to listen? So, who's that false prophet that Satan's going to use to get them to listen to receive their mark? In the Dark Ages, 538 to 1798, it was the Protestant churches that did God's work. So when the Millerites stand up and they say, Babylon is fallen, they recognize the sins and see how much the churches that used to do God's work have gone back to Babylon. So they were standing and then they fall. When we consider the Republican Party and its formation in 1854, if I write that, you'll know. Okay, I'll write it in full. Republican Party formed. You get to 1863, and Abraham Lincoln, who's part of the Republican Party, is going to declare slavery illegal. And you're going to go through the decades where they support abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to former enslaved people, giving, this is a story about slavery, giving black men the right to vote, and as you go on, and the various rights that come, the various rights afforded to women, it was the Republican Party that drove that agenda initially. And so they are doing God's work in our time period, in our dark ages. They are standing because that's what God wants them to do. They're fighting for the social issues that God cares about. And then as you go through time, they slowly start dropping. They slowly start falling until you get to 1970s, 1980s, etc., where now there's a complete realignment. This realignment had started decades before, but now it's a complete switch as the voter base has switched and the political parties changed their platforms. Ronald Reagan is going to take on fighting against these civil issues, these human rights, if you can put it that. So what I'm suggesting is that where we had the evangelical churches standing and then falling, today in a culture war where political parties are the churches, the Republican Party is the thing that stood and the thing that falls. So in a church setting, in a Christian America, the churches that stand and fall are your Protestant churches. But in politics, in a culture war, it's your Republican Party that does that, as they bring you to the Sunday law. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The steps that we went through.
Yeah.
When I'm going through different topics, but I promise I'll try and bring them together at the end. And if I don't, then call me out. But when we do time setting, so we recognize that the Millerites had literal time prophecies to do their time setting. So something encoded in the Bible to do that time setting. The 2300s, 2300 days, etc., etc. The 490. So literal encoded, God said it's going to be from year to year. But then when we come to the 2520, there's something different. And that's why Adventism has so much pain over it. Because where do we get the 2520? Or the idea or the premise of a 2520?
The 7 times.
And what do those 7 times represent in their original context?
Intensity.
So you have God saying, intensity, through Moses, that if you keep sinning, I'm just going to punish you harder and harder and harder. So 7 times has absolutely nothing to do with time. You have to, how do we get to the 2520 from the 7 times? So originally, the words are 7 times. In Hebrew, it's, I don't even want to go into the Hebrew, but these are the words. Now, how do you get to 2520?
Day for a year. That's 7 times 360.
Mm-hmm.
It's
So
one
you
time, yes.
so you say that a time is 360. So here it's intensity in the original context, but then you take that word out of its original context and then you attach it to something else elsewhere in the Bible and you make it 360. And then you're going to say 7 of those and you're going to get to 2520. And then you do the exact same thing we do the exact same thing in Daniel 5. When we want to find out the 2520, the 126, the 151. In each of these cases, when you go through the methodology of how to get to the final thing, my point is you jump, you make large jumps to get to that final number that you're going to time set with. I'm making this point to show just how, in inverted commas, ridiculous it is. And that's why Adventism has such pain towards us, because this in the original context has nothing to do with what we're going to use for time setting. There's jumps that we have to do to get to that point. And obviously I say ridiculous facetiously because that's methodology. It's taking something, making it into a symbol, and then using that symbol for whatever it is you want to do. And you have to be grounded in different rules on how you do it, etc., etc. You just can't start plucking things out of the air. But that's the point that I want to make from that. So, taking these ideas of Republican Party bringing the Sunday law, time setting, how we do it, it's symbolic. It's you take a symbol and you use that symbol to predict to a story. You attach it to a story. I think it was 3 weeks ago. I can't remember where it was, but I did a study on this idea of time setting and using the 126 and how that's the key that unlocks time, etc., to demonstrate that you get from 1898 to 2024 amongst a lot of other things, and I won't go into the details of why I do that and how I do that, because that's not this study. But the point of this was that here you have America as a superpower, and here you have USA as a superpower. Maybe we can discuss that a bit more at the end. But what I want to get from this is just the jumps that you do to get to being able to time set.
Just for those
back
who
to
watch,
some...
it was PIP Ministry where you did that.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
PIP.
PIP. And I want to take us back to some old studies in the movement. As I think in looking at old stuff, we can glean truth for our time. In 2016, light opened up about the King of the North and the King of the South. And so for anyone who remembers, where was that? What Bible story was that?
Daniel 11.
Yeah, Raphael Panium.
Daniel 11, verse 11. So I'll paraphrase just for time's sake. How much time do I have left, Lizanne?
40.
14 minutes if you take 1.5 hours.
Okay. We'll finish before that and then go through just a recap and stuff. But Daniel 11 and that story is about Raphael and Panium. So in Daniel 11 verse 11, you have the Battle of Raphael, and that took place in the year 217 BC. The King of the South wins against the King of the North. And then Panium, you have the commentary about Panium in verse 13. Verse 13, 14, 15. And that's in 200 BC. And amidst this battle of Panium in this year, Daniel is going to point out that there's someone who's going to be introduced in the scene. In verse 14, and in those times there shall many stand up against the King of the South, So lots of nations started warring against Egypt in that history. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Uriah Smith's going to give commentary about how Rome started interfering in world politics at this time. So you have Rome rising up. So you have Rome here until you get to verse 16, where Pompey is going to do a bunch of stuff. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his will, and none shall stand before him. And it's this part that I want to point out. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So Pompey is going to march into the glorious land, into Judea, in 63 BC. And we understood this to be the Sunday law. We lined up verse 16 with the Sunday law. So 63 BC, if you remember that. Uriah Smith points that out, that Pompey is going to do all this, Rome's going to do all this. It did not, however, acquire jurisdiction over Judea by actual conquest till BC 63. So I looked into this history because someone had asked me a question about something unrelated, but something else piqued my interest. So I want to read you something from Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is just the first source that I found, but as you read more into it, it opens up, the interest around it opens up. But we mark Julius Caesar at the Sunday law because he's a dictator, and we say dictators, Sunday law, or close of probation, etc. But in 63 BC, Julius Caesar's political career kicked off. So here's the Sunday law. Pompey is going to march into Judea, and I'll read what was going on with Julius Caesar in 63 BC. In 63 BC, Caesar stood for the praetorship. So there's going to be 2 elections in this year. One is praetor, and also for the post of Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus, who was the head of the College of Pontiffs and the highest ranking state religious official. So a religious role, this took place early in the year in 63 BC, and then he has a state role given to him later in the year. He faced off against 2 different people in this election for Pontifex Maximus. And the names were Publius Servilius Isauricus, however you say that. And the other one was our favorite person, Quintus Lutatius Catulus. And many scholars, when reviewing this history, they were surprised that Julius Caesar won, because he was a populist at the time, but he was a nobody. And these 2, Publius and Quintus, were part of the establishment, if you can call it that. They were well-respected senators, but Julius Caesar essentially went around asking people for money to fund his campaign, and getting all these bribes because people were like, if you get into office, then do this for me. And he goes to his wife on the day of the election and says to his wife, either I'm going to come home as Pontifex Maximus, or I'm not going to come home at all, because of all that money he had taken from people to fund his election campaign. But reading about what this office was, Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus, which is Latin for Supreme Pontiff, was the chief high priest of the College of Pontiffs in ancient Rome. This was the most important position in the ancient Roman religion. This was the most important position that Julius Caesar had got to date. And it reads on, etc., etc. The word pontifex and its derivative pontiff became terms used for Christian bishops, including the Bishop of Rome. So that's where we get pontiff for the Pope today. It's from this position, Pontificus Maximus. In a book called Caesar by an author called Adrian Goldsworthy, he says the following about this role. I'll paraphrase it. Basically that this post of Pontifex, I'll post it in the chat and then paraphrase it, just so you have it for your records. The election was in 63 BC. To someone asked in the chat, I didn't see the name. And Adrian Goldsworthy is basically going to point out that before it used to be an election, and then some corrupt people changed it and then made it by appointment. So that person was just appointed. But in this year, prior to this election, it was turned back into a popular election. So now there's going to be a vote for who's going to be the head of the churches, essentially. And the other quote was just how important this role was. So the three people that were involved here. We have Julius Caesar, obviously. And just to remind us that Caesar means elephant killer. This has been covered by other teachers in the past. Julius is July is where you get from Julius. You get July from Julius because he was born in July, and so he names the month after himself. And so I'm going to tie that to July. And then Quintus, we all are aware of how that's changed into July. And then Publius Servilius, this is the one that I want to explore a bit more. Publius Servilius. Publius means of the people. And Servilius, in its literal meaning, means servant or slave. However, at the time, service, this bit, service meant slave in Latin, later Latin. But for the Romans, it just meant someone who served in duty or was loyal. It didn't necessarily mean slave. So it was a servant of the people. That's what this name represents. Servant of the people. So what I want to tie to this waymark of 63 BC is a vote, because it was an election, the name Julius Caesar, as the elephant killer, the name Quintus, and Publius Servilius. Now, there is a bit of controversy about whether Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges can go at the Sunday law waymark in 272, because historians are going to say that that transaction actually took place in 273, so Quintus can't go there. But in a separate story, there's another Quintus that can. So the question can be asked, can you even use names to time set? Can you take a name, look at its meaning, and attach it to other things to bring about time setting? And I demonstrated how the 2520 and the 126 come about through similar circumstances. that you take it out of its original context, you look at the meaning of what this word means, and then you use that to time set. Whether you're going to use it to time set to July or whatever it is not necessarily what I'm trying to get at. It's, can you do it with a name or not? And that's the point that I was trying to make with the time setting, is that, in my opinion, this is completely valid methodology of taking a name, turning it into a symbol, and then using that symbol to identify a time in history. So this, I'm going to line this up with the Sunday law, and I'm just going to say, without proving it, I'm just going to say 2024. If you recall back at where we started, there were two events that I mentioned that the Sunday law is composed of. You're going to have something that's the cause. It was 533. And then you're going to have something that's the effect. So for Julius Caesar, it was pontiff, being made pontiff, and then praetor. Let me bring this down. We didn't discuss the election on the praetorship because I couldn't find much detail about him winning that election. All that online sources say is that he won the election in 63 BC and then took office in 62 BC. It doesn't give much detail about who he fought against in the election, etc. But so religious and then civil. I won't go into what the praetor was, but it was a civil role essentially. And I discussed how the Republican Party is the church in our culture war. So in 533, where the Pope is made head of all the churches, in 63 BC, where Julius Caesar is made pontiff, head of all the churches, I'm suggesting that when Trump is elected as head of the Republican Party in 2024, that's him being made pontiff of said Republican Party. And that took place in July. And when he does that, the old GOP that you could have said was standing at one point is fallen. Because as Caesar means, elephant killer, so Caesar, the symbol being elephant, Republican Party being that symbol, that's dead now. And that's the fallen in our context. And then you fast forward 5 months later to December 17, and the Electoral College is going to vote to give power to this image that was created. So you have an image created, and the dragon, which is a state entity, is going to give life / power to what was created before. So now this pontiff is now going to have power while in office. You might ask the question, okay, why not November 5? Because that's when people voted. But the reason why I pick December 17 is because this is an institution created in the Constitution. Whereas in November, that's citizens voting. And what they're voting for is representatives, essentially, to go and vote on their behalf in December. The story of Acts 27 at Malta is a story about institutions. It's not a story about individuals. And I went through in a fair amount of detail, in my opinion, last week about this story of the mark of the beast and what that mark of the beast, where we can place that mark of the beast. That story about the mark of the beast is a story about how institutions are going to get people to receive a mark of the beast. And that takes place at the loud cry to the close of probation. And so this MOB is not there at the Sunday law. The issue arrives there from these institutions, but its enforcement takes place at the loud cry and at the close of probation, because that's where the seal of God is placed. In Daniel 12:1, where Michael stands up, everyone's character is sealed, if you want to put it simply. I think as is being taught now, which I can see I need to think about it a bit more, that this is a process, but if we take it at a simple level, this is where it is finished. Not here, here. And it's the institutions that do this work. The Sunday law story is not a story about individuals. That's all to say why I place December 17 and not an election in November 5. So that was jumping all over the place, but I hope I threaded that together well enough. So just to summarize where we started, thinking about the threefold union broken up into three separate parts: dragon, beast, false prophet. Two religious, one state. I have suggested in the past, and I'm suggesting now, that this state entity is the USA, because it's the same as the lamb-like beast. It just changes how it behaves. The beast as the papacy, and the false prophet in a culture war as the Republican Party. Now, if you ask yourself, or if you ask me, does that mean that the churches are not involved in this story? I'm not denying that. I'm just looking at this in a specific context, telling a specific story. There's a different story that you can tell about the churches. But one thing I will ask about the churches is, if our line, and you take it as one line from 1989 to the Second Advent, in this story, were the churches standing prior to 1989? They weren't. They had already fallen long time ago. They were opposed to God throughout that 1 to 6 years. And so when you get to 2001, it's fallen. But when you get to Sunday law, it's fallen is fallen. And so I'm making the case that those churches had fallen a long time ago. There's no need to tell us that they've fallen now. And so we went from that to discuss this idea of church and state together, how the papacy had this cause and effect, needed to become the papacy in charge. We spoke about this idea of first being pure and standing and then falling. The churches, the Protestant churches, in my opinion, were not pure in the 1 to 6. And then the moral majority and this idea of Satan needing a church or a vehicle to give their message to the world. And the churches were never going to be able to do that job in the 21st century, given how irreligious America has become. No one would live. Like, imagine if Satan's message is be sexist, and Satan goes to the evangelical churches and say, you go about bringing this, and the evangelicals go knocking on doors. Every Gen Z person would just close the door immediately. But if you have someone like Steve Bannon or Elon Musk giving you TikToks, that's a much more convincing messenger, in my opinion. And time setting and how many leaps we do to get to the 25-20 and the 1-6 should, in my opinion, answer questions about whether or not it's valid to use a name as a symbol to time set. I'm not asking you whether you agree with July or not. It's the validity of doing it. That's what I'm more concerned about. And then discuss 63 BC and this election for Pontificus Maximus. It's a religious role, and Trump fulfills this role as Julius Caesar in being made the head of Satan's church, which is what happens in the RNC. So,
Curtis,
yeah.
you are placing now Publius Servius and Quintus also at the Sunday law. You are taking only the symbols from their name, as I now understood, but they were the opposing. They were opposing Julius Caesar, and
I haven't thought about what it means with regards to you have Julius Caesar on one side and the other. I haven't
was
thought
thinking
about
that. Like, can you see Julius Caesar
on one side and
represented
the
by
other?
Trump, and then the others, his opponents? Or...
So one thing that I did pick up is that Publius and Quintus were the establishment. So they were pretty much already working in government. And then you have this populist stand-up, which is Trump, Julius Caesar, and the establishment loses. So I'm suggesting that what we can see from that story is that the purge of the Republican Party is complete, because the establishment don't have the chance against this populist that's rising.
Thank you.
So yeah, does anyone have any questions on any of those specific things?
I have a question. This line that you drew here with the loud cry and the close of probation, with the institution going to people. First, you had drawn the story of the ship that shipwrecked at Malta, right? That's what you built up. I think you erased it, and then you wrote Sunday law, loud cry, close and probation. Could you just go over it again? I didn't catch the connection from the shipwrecking, and then how you build it on top of that to get...
So this ship that shipwrecks is the Sixth Kingdom. That's the USA. Tess will draw it like you have the Sixth Kingdom falling, and then the Seventh Kingdom rising. No. Seventh Kingdom rising. And essentially what the job of this Sixth Kingdom was to do what God asked Nebuchadnezzar to do, to be a protector of God's people. But then the Sixth Kingdom doesn't do that. They end up going off course, and now they end up being a problem for God's people. And so this institution now gets shipwrecked because they don't do the work of protecting God's people. And what I was trying to point out is that this is a story of institutions. So when this institution falls, this institution's going to, I'm just going to draw a crown, is going to be risen, and it's going to do a work. And the work that this institution, number 7, is going to do is going to affect people in this history. So post the Sunday law waymark, in giving a message to say, worship the image of the beast, receive the mark of the beast, etc. But the thing that this waymark is about, this Sunday law waymark is about, as bringing to a close, is a story of this Sixth Kingdom. The reason why I was elaborating this point over and over and over again is because when we look at the various elections that take place in this year, what do those elections represent, or what's the purpose of those elections prophetically? I'm suggesting that it's not an election about receiving the mark of the beast, about where you're going to stand on the right or the wrong side. It's a story about the institutions and their role with regards to this waymark. Does that answer you a bit?
Yeah, it does. Could you repeat the last part also, where you highlighted the loud cry and the close of probation just once more? So it's the mark of the beast is not given at Sunday law. You just explained that.
So you have a
but
message that comes at the Sunday law waymark.
Mhm.
So you have a message unsealed. And unsealed. Let me draw. In 2001, you have the third angel arriving, and that third angel is going to say, watch out everyone, the image of the beast is going to tell you to worship itself, don't receive the mark of the beast. But no one's really listening. And then you get to 2021, which I don't know if it's a movement consensus, but I'm just going to say it as a matter of fact, is you have the agitation of the Sunday law. And now people are going to start paying attention that something's wrong here. But it's not until the Sunday law where you have the angel of Revelation 18 come down and give power to this third angel that's running through history that no one is listening to. And then it's going to swell. And Ellen White will say it swells into a loud cry. And that loud cry is now, don't receive the mark of the beast, because look at what's in front of you. I think Aryan had said in the international camp meeting that this is where you see everything, and everything is visible, both politically and the message-wise, because everything is visible politically. Now this message can be shouting at the top of its voice. See, I told you so. It's right there in front of your eyes. So now everyone has a choice to make. Are they going to follow whatever this thing is or not? And then it's that decision that gives you the mark of the beast or the seal of God. I'm not trying to define what those are, but that's the point that I was making there. That this message that is unsealed here is the message that's going to bring you to the loud cry internally and externally, the mark of the beast.
Got it. And is that something that is seen in the story of the ship that shipwrecks on Malta? Because the ship shipwrecks at Malta, the sixth institution ends. And did you then build on top of that story, like in terms of what goes on the island of Malta, or did you end that story, that thread there?
I ended it there. I was just, the only point that I was bringing out here was that this that culminates here is institutions. I mean, you can build on that thread in the fact that this seventh kingdom that's rise is now standing here is the dragon. And then this dragon is going to be, like for the papacy, the arms of the papacy. So it's going to be the arms of the image of the beast. So the image of the beast is created in July, and now the state, the US institutions of the state, the executive branch, judicial branch, executive branch, etc., are now going to give life to this image that was created. Yeah. That's how I see things, at least.
Thanks.
Yep.
So, and as I've understood now, another point is that you're saying like 533 and 538 are actually two waymarks, but it is one waymark, it's Sunday law. You're also saying it's July to December is Sunday law.
Yeah.
Did I understand that right?
Yes. That 533 in a different story can be understood as a different waymark. But in this story about an image created and an image given life, it's one waymark, and it's the bookend of one waymark, the start and the end of that one waymark, if you want to call it that, the cause and the effect. What is interesting, and I've thought not to make a big deal about it, because there's a delicate balance when doing time setting with doing numeric symbology and numerology, i.e. just seeing coincidences and tying them to stuff. So you have to be careful with taking a symbol and using that and just finding numbers all over the place. But one thing that is interesting is that between 533 and 538, it's a 5-year period, and then between July and December, it's a 5-month period, and you have Quintus there, which in its original meaning just means 5, but then we get 5-month because you were named Quintus by being born in the 5th month. And 5, when you run it through the Bible and see what it's attached to the story of judgment, or it's attached to judgment. So in this story, this institution that's shipwrecked is judged. And so I'm pointing out that at both these instances, there are 2 different institutions that get judged, that fall, that make up the shipwreck, that hold America together, were meant to do the right thing for the US. An informal institution, a political party, and then a formal one, the mechanisms of the US, if I can put it that.
And would you then say that this is, I mean, 𝗷𝗴𝗃𝗲 said, of course, it's July, and you're saying now it's July to December. It's an expansion of this message, or how would you see it yourself? More
Yeah, that's for you to decide. Yeah, that's for you to. I take this concept of cause and effect is 𝗷𝗴𝗃𝗲 has spoken about cause and effect within a waymark. That in one waymark there's a story that you're telling, and that story has a point where that story begins and that story ends. And the reason why I think this is important, because you could ask the question, and which, as I have been asked the question, why can't you just pick one, as in the most important one of the 2? But once you do that, and you just start looking at dates as just random dates, those dates mean nothing in and of themselves. Those dates have a thread attached to them, if you want to call it that, a story attached to them. And if you just see dates at waymarks, you miss the story that's being built. So another question that can be asked is, who cares what dates you attach to the Sunday Law waymark? And the counterpoint to that will be, as soon as you detach the dates from the story that's being told, you miss what the development or the progression of this story is. So I spent I spent some time trying to point out that it's the Republican Party that create the image of the beast. That's their sin. That's their problem. Because if you don't see that, you end up getting to a point where, just like in 2016, when we had the last 4 presidents, and we were questioning who this last president is and who's going to be far richer. I don't know if you remember, it was either Trump or Clinton, and it got to a point where we were saying, well, they're both rich, or maybe not say we, people were saying, they're both rich and they're both corrupt, so I guess it can be one of them. But what we've refined and what we've pointed out is that it could only ever have been Trump. So even though they're both corrupt, there's one person that does the damage. Why am I saying all this? Oh, so with regards to dates, is that if you start looking at both the Democrats and the Republicans as being they all corrupt, then you miss what the issues are, as in who's the blame for each of this issue. There's blame for the North and there's blame for the South. Let's look at the blame for the North and put it at that, but then let's look at who creates this problem. And it's the Republican Party that does this. And I tried demonstrating at the UK camp meeting that typically it's conservative parties that, in trying to get power, they end up making a deal with the devil, because generally, in inverted commas, people want to be treated nicely. And it's your more liberal parties that fight for those rights. And so they will win elections in fighting against the establishment. And so conservative parties in this losing battle turn to the devil to try and get power. And so hence why populists find it easier to rise through conservative parties. That's not saying it doesn't happen with liberal parties. But yeah, who's to blame and what the blame is for who, I think is important to establish. So when we get to July, that elephant that's killed, I'm saying is important to see that that elephant is dead, because they were standing once and now they've fallen.
So Republicanism died and Trumpism.
Yeah, took
Won.
over.
And in the beginning, you said something, and I don't remember the direct question, but you said, why does John say it's three parts somehow? Like
Oh yeah. Why does John
Yeah.
specifically
You said,
say,
I'll come to that.
and this is me coming to it. I was waiting for someone to bring it up again. You see, it was a test. It's because John is trying to make a specific point about who leads the world to Armageddon, if you want to call it that. So the Democrats or the North are not going to be included in those threefold entities, because they're not the ones who bring the world to Armageddon. It's those three entities. The North, or the Democrats, have their own sins to be judged for and to bear and etc. But that's not the story that John is telling when John talks about Babylon. I brought that up because recently I had received the comment that Babylon is everything. It's all of the institutions that are wrong in this world. But when you stick to the story and the symbol that's being used, as students of prophecy, I think we have to allocate those symbols correctly, or else we
Then
end
you
up
say
just
It's
putting
USA,
everything all up in.
papacy, and Republican Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my question then, because you say the threefold union is USA, papacy, and the Republican Party. So the Republican Party being one entity of the threefold union. But Elder Terry was saying that the threefold union is within the Republican Party.
It's
How
like
can we reconcile that?
it's
That-
like fractals.
Yeah.
It's like fractals, because those three entities are each going to have a specific ideology. Libertarianism, Catholicism, and what's the other one?
Barstool conservatism.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
the Catholicism is integralism, right?
yeah. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
False prophet. I'm just going to put there false prophet. I mean, she's going to tie them to specific threads within the Republican Party, etc. I think that that is just the application, a fractal of the bigger story.
Okay.
Because the dragon, which is libertarianism, as I had tried to demonstrate, is a state. It's a country. But that country is going to have an ideology attached to it. So then you're going to have, in the fractal of where the problem is, the Republican Party, you're going to have each of the different streams feeding different messages. That's what Revelation 16 is. It's messages, really. And then Catholicism, etc. False prophet. What is interesting about Catholicism is that when we think about the USA versus Russia and the famous proxy war that we like to talk about is Syria, there's going to be two different groups fighting in Syria, but this is a proxy war. So does the USA need to be on the ground in that proxy war? No. Does Russia? No. Although Russia gets involved. I'm not getting into those intricacies. But the point is that the party that these proxies are fighting for doesn't need to be there to get the victory. So when we read about the image of the beast here, and worship being given to the image of the beast because of the work that the dragon and the false prophet are going to do, does the papacy need to be there? Because that's what this image is. It's just a proxy. And the answer is no. Because it's the proxy that's getting worship to give worship to the beast. I bring that up because there's lots of questions about, okay, where's the papacy in all of this? And at least for now, in my mind, I don't see them, and I don't see them being a part of this story because of Revelation 13 and the fact that they receive their homage from the image of the beast that gives them homage. But obviously, that's one story. In a different story, you can point out that in that threefold union, there's a different message for different types of people, for Catholics, for atheists, libertarians, for Protestants, etc. So there's that story that you can tell as well. Yeah. So.
The question.
No, that was actually the papacy. Because you have all the way at the top of your notes, you had those three groups. And I was wondering, because you said state, religious, and then you say it's USA state, and then you have papacy, Republican Party. So you still have, you say we're not in a religious time anymore, but you still mark papacy there. So it's like papacy, Republican Party.
Yeah, I say, when I say religious, I substitute it with politics. They two in the same thing. That's the point that I was trying to make. And then this religious here that you have here, I answered it at the end, that this is just done through proxy. Because the sins of the papacy, if you trace them, they're political issues. When you want to talk about slavery, when you want to talk about the point that 𝗷𝗴𝗲𝗏 was making about 1888, that Sunday law history, perhaps we can rethink how Ellen White and the pioneers looked at it, that it wasn't really a religious issue, it was this human rights issue. So it was politics, because that's what politics is. It's about society. And so when you come to today, again, politics. So in reality, if you want to be true to everything, it's politics, politics, politics. USA, papacy, there. The reason why we make this distinction of religious is because it's a religious organization that's driving this thing.
Okay. All right. And another question, it's the names that you, can you scroll to the names? Because you say Quintus means July and Julius, down. There. You said Julius is July, Quintus is July. Julius, does it have a meaning? Because you now make an application of it, basically.
Yeah, I'm making application of what that name originally means. I'm just looking in my
because
notes.
Julius is not referring to the month.
Yeah, it's not. And I accept that. It
Means youthful.
Yeah, youthful or something.
Okay.
So when you are doing the Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, Daniel is going to look at those words that are written there, and he's going to say, you're found wanting, weighed in the balances. But the original meaning means something else. And then we're going to come and say, actually, let's not take what Daniel says. Let's find something else that it's attached to and then make it suit our purposes. So that's why I'm suggesting you can do it.
No, I'm not
yeah,
saying...
yeah. I'm not saying you can't.
Yeah.
You can't. It's.
I'm only thinking, and actually like this better than what Elder Terry does. I've been looking into that in the Quintus, Fabius, Maximus, Gurgius, that I think basically you have three parts. That names is, I mean, it's four names, but basically three parts. Maximus Goertjes is one thing, and then you have Quintus and Fabius. And I think all three are looked at in a different way, or the how do you say that? The meaning of that she's getting out of it. She uses a different source. So Maximus Goertjes is basically, that's what Elder Tess did. It's maximum flood. It's from the Bible. When you go to Fabius, she goes to Roman history because the faba bean is a symbol for election, and Quintus is basically referring to the month. So it's basically July. So Quintus is basically literal. She takes the literal meaning of it. Fabius, she's going to Roman history, and Maximus Goertjes, she's going to the Bible to get her answer. And I was like, this is where my question is that right to do? And I like yours actually better because I think you're more consistent in where you get your answer from.
And so just about Quintus, just for clarity, is that Quintus means fifth. It doesn't mean fifth month.
No, I know, but it is in the context of the name.
And you have that.
Yes, it is because of the month.
That month. Whether it's valid to do it where you break it up, I guess, is a question you have to ask. Whether you could use, like, within one specific thing, use different parts. I don't know. You'd have to answer that for yourself. But whether, if we were just to take Quintus in isolation, I think it's legitimate. If you were to take faba beans just in isolation, I think it's legitimate. Etc. And the question is always, like, how do you know when to take something literally and when to tie it to something historical, etc.? That's what we would call the art of it. That it's just.
No, I've been looking into it, and I'm kind of like, I don't know, but that's my big question to her approach. Still. And that's why I liked this one better. Yep.
What surprised me about this this story about Julius Caesar Quintus Publius is why I like it is because a model has integrity when you can go to a completely separate story and then tell the same story. And so in this story about Rome's rise in Daniel 11, and outside of the controversy about whether you can put Quintus Fabius Maximus Goertjes in a different story, you can put the same thing there. And I don't want to make it supernatural and say, yeah, God had a backup plan. But I found it neat. At least.
It's nice. Yeah.
But so my backing to all of this isn't even this. It's not the July or it's the role that Julius Caesar won, the Pontiff Maximus, the head of churches, and it's that story about the Republican Party as being the church and the vote for being the head of that church. That's the story that I'm telling. These are just secondary.
Yeah, because that's what you said in your previous study in Germany. I think you said also the same thing, that the symbol is only a bridge to the more important thing, which is the compare and contrast you want to do of two histories.
Yeah.
I like
it's the story that and I think Elder Parminder had made the point that your strongest piece of methodology is compare and contrast. So it's this compare and contrast of your Praetor or Pontificus Maximus that I find neat. And then these are just going to help you point you in the right direction of where to look for that story. Now, many people have asked me questions about the story of the King of the South and the King of the North, and my constant answer to that is, I don't know. Because in the words of Aryan, I don't know how he phrases it. I'm not a student of this thing. I'm a student of this thing. Yeah. There is something that I would like to, would like to point out about that story, about the King of the South, though, and it's just a question, is that in the story of Beneventum and is it 272? Pyrrhus is going to leave Italy at Beneventum, and then he's going to go back home. And in 272, Aldetes is going to mark four things on her board work. She's going to mark the fact that Tarentum falls. She's going to mark the fact that Pyrrhus dies. Then she's going to put Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurgis. I won't do that one just because there's questions about it. And then she's going to point out that Pyrrhus was 46 years old. So this story, there's two stories going on here, is that Tarentum is a story about a sphere of influence that was told here. So you tie these together with regards to sphere of influence. The elephant story is, at this waymark specifically, is related to Pyrrhus dying. And so if you want to call it internal, external, this is Pyrrhus dying internal, and this is Pyrrhus's, or the King of the South's, external exploits. And then this 46. I don't know what it means, but what is neat, or what question came to my mind, is that Biden was the 46th president. And so what we do with all of that, I don't know. I'll leave that to the specialists.
Right. Curtis, I had one question. Can you scroll back to this one? Yeah, where you have the Sunday law with the bookends.
Yeah.
Because you put in, you start with the RMC in July. There they make their king in the RMC.
There they create the image.
They create it, and can you also should you then also put in this same history then the 5th of November, and maybe put after December also January 6th and January 20, because these are all waymarks Trump needs to get through to get in his seat.
The thing I think we need to be careful about is we can recognize a full year as being a waymark, and we do that with 2014, and we do that with 2019 as well. But in that year, there'll be various stories that you're wanting to tell. So internal, we'll say on the Western Front, internal to America and the civil war that's going on there, is, at least how I understand it, is that there's two specific dates associated with what's going on in that story. And so in this story, God wants us to see two specific things, whether that's November and December, or January 1 and January 20, 2025. I don't know, whatever dates you're going to give those, is that there's a bookend for this story. So all in between here, sure, you have November 5 in there, but this story that's being told about this internal war ends here. There's another story that you can tell where you're going to give different dates and etc. And that history is going to be encapsulated in that. It's just like with years, for instance. We know that 2021 is an important year. Or let me do this. 2014 is an important year. There were many important things that happened in 2015, but for some reason we don't put put them on the line, but it was significant events in 2015. I think Trump announces I don't know when he announces his candidacy. In the early year, that was significant, but we don't mark that as, a key milestone. And then you get to 2016. The point is that there's key things that I think God wants us to see in the bookend. So your bookend would be 2014 and 2019. And then there's all these things that happen in between there. And then you can just zoom down, etc., etc., etc. So when we get to here, July and December, in the story that I'm telling, this is the bookend where that story starts and where that story ends. In a different story, for instance, the story of the fight between the King of the North and the King of the South, those will have two different bookends. Because ultimately you can end up with a line with just date after date after date, especially with the rate Trump is going now. How are we going to have any insight into what's a waymark with the way he's behaving?
Crazy.
So,
but why? Can you then maybe repeat why December is the end of this story?
Sure. So in other studies, I've tried to break down who the dragon is, and I've said that libertarian. Now, the different institutions that make up the USA. An institution can be a law, an institution can be a playbook by how a country runs, etc. The Supreme Court is the easiest place to see this. Supreme Court. Current Supreme Court, with regards to how it overturns, why it's overturning certain stuff. So Roe v. Wade. That's a pure libertarian overturning. It's not because, I don't know what Clarence Thomas's and all the other justices' views are on abortion, but that's not their primary motive for overturning Roe v. Wade. Their primary motive is this libertarian argument, i.e. give it back to the states. Let the states decide, which is a libertarian argument. So that's one place where you see it. Another place where you see it is the Electoral College. How the Electoral College came about was this argument that the founders were having with regards to how do you decide who's going to vote? Should it be a popular election, i.e. just everyone in the country votes and we decide them as a president? Or do we need like a gatekeeper? Because it's easy for populists to just get the vote from everyone and then win. And Alexander Hamilton was scared of that. So he said, let's have an electoral college where these elites will take the opinion from the people and then finally decide who's going to be president or not. So if a populace appeals to the people, we can, as elites, say, actually, no, we're not doing that. And then on the other side, you had Thomas Jefferson and everyone else arguing that that's not pretty democratic. If everyone's vote means nothing and you're just giving it to elites, then how can we be a democratic nation? And so you have the states, because you have federal government and then you have states. Jefferson saying, let's give power to the states. So you have what are called, I can't remember the name, electors. So there's different electors that are apportioned to. Another interesting thing is that there's 538 electors in total, and they are divided between the states. Small states typically will have fewer electors because there's fewer people in there. And Thomas Jefferson's going to make the argument that that's not fair, because if the population votes and there's few people in these small states, then decisions that this president makes is going to be for the majority. So the states where there's few people are not going to be heard, essentially. And it's why this is interesting is because often we look at libertarianism in bad light. But Thomas Jefferson, a libertarian, is making this argument to fight for the rights of people. And Alexander Hamilton we look at as being in good light. But the reason why Thomas Jefferson was fighting so hard is because the USA was running away from a monarchy. He didn't want a king to be created. I'm giving all this backlog of story to say that the creation of this electoral college and how it works today is this compromise between this gatekeeper and this libertarian school of thought that power needs to be distributed to the states. So we say libertarianism is you have big government, small government, and Aldertes is going to say that the states fighting for rights and etc. is libertarian. But you can see that there's a lot of good in that. That if you just had power concentrated in the top, you end up with a king. So, coming back to your question, this institution, because it's an institution, it's an institution born out of libertarian thinking. And so, the dragon, being a state, has various institutions that are libertarian. So my tying all that together is that the Electoral College is that institution that the dragon uses to give power to this image that's created. When the people vote in November, they're just voting as people. So it's not a story about people. It's a story about institutions and the dragon giving them power. When the people vote, they're not representative of the dragon. It's the Electoral College that is.
Okay, that's interesting.
And they voted on December 17th, right?
Yeah. I mean, one could make the argument that, and I guess it's the same, because in July, in the lead up to July, you had the people placing their votes up until the RNC or the DNC or whatever in their various states. They say who they want to run the party. But in July, it's your officials, if you want to call it that. Officials who are going to vote based on what the people said. So your electors. And I got this principle from a teacher in the room, I won't call names, that when you tie bookends together, this story should be seen at the end of that story. And so in December, the people vote before.
The mini version.
Yeah, the mini version, exactly. The people vote before, and the end of that waymark, or that bookend, is tied together because it's the same dynamic. People, then electors, and in December it's first people, then electors.
I think even July, the vote, the RNC is basically an electoral college vote.
Yeah.
Compared to what are they called? The votes before?
The primaries.
Primaries, yes. That's where people vote.
Yeah.
July, it's basically the
electoral college. Yeah. So whether you say, I'm tempted to say December 18 and not 17, because in July 18, is it July 18? Yeah, July 18, that's when Trump accepts his nomination. But they had the Electoral College of the RNC, in inverted commas, had voted on like the 16th or something. And then why Aldertes is going to be forced to mark 18 is because that's when Trump accepts the nomination. And so on 17, they vote, the Electoral College votes, and on 18, Trump is going to, in inverted commas, accept that nomination. And the only reason why I want to do that, or have thoughts of doing that, is because you have 18 and 18. And December 18 is a date we already have on our line. I can't remember which one it is.
Yeah, sure.
I
Raffia?
thought it was December 19 that we marked previous.
There's that one, but there's another one with December 18. I just can't remember which one it is.
Okay.
So I'm not going to get into the pedantics of whether it's 17 or 18. It's more so identifying that it's the state that does this work and not the people, because it's the dragon that gives power to the image of the beast.
That was it.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Dragon,
No problem.
it needs to be an institution.
Any other questions?
Any other
Or
questions? We
should
can
we
close.
close?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay.
No?
I will close with a word of prayer.
Okay.
Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to study together. It's my prayer that we may all have benefited and been enriched by this experience. If we are moving in step with you, then God be praised. If we are not, then I pray that you may help us. I pray and ask that as we go through the rest of our week, that we may remember you, and remember, as I keep praying to you, that we may not get lost in the external and forget about the internal, and the fact that this is a story about our reformation. And I pray that we may keep that at the forefront of our minds in all of the fun that we're having in these discussions. I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.